on where we will discuss Indian literature and its place in global literature. And to initiate this discussion, may I invite onto the dais Christoph Senft, Regine Hollander, Breen, Boyd Tonkin, and Milee Ashwarya. Christoph Senft studied English literature, German literature, history and political science at the universities of Tübingen, Brisbane and Pune. He worked as researcher in the EU research project in Globe and as academic assistant and lecturer at the University of Potsdam, where he also wrote his PhD thesis on contemporary Indian writing in English. In October 2014, he joined Pune University as a lecturer and became director of the DAAD Information Center, Pune. Regine Hollander is a French citizen and holds a doctorate in American civilization from the University of Paris, Sorbonne. She taught for many years at the University of Panthéon-Assas, Paris too. She has written and ghost-written half a dozen novels. She has also co-written several feature film scripts which have been produced. She is the author of several academic books and many articles published in academic journals. She has a wide experience in translation, both technical and literary. She is a fellow of the Salzburg Seminar. Breen is the author of The Casuals and Atomic City, nominated for Book of the Year in the Queensland Literary Awards in 2014. Her creative and non-fiction work has been published widely, including features in the Asia Literary Review, Review of Australian Fiction, Overland, Griffith Review, and the Australian and the Age. She is fiction editor of the Griffith Review, and senior lecturer in writing and publishing at Griffith University. Boyd Tonkin is a British journalist and critic who chaired the judging panel of the 2016 Man Booker International Prize. Formerly literary editor and senior writer of The Independent, and before that, literary editor of The New Statesman, he now contributes to The Observer and Financial Times, to magazines including The Economist and The Spectator, and broadcasts for BBC Radio. In 2001, he refounded the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize, which he judged until 2015. He has reported on cultural and literary issues for more than 30 countries and has been an invited speaker at festivals and conferences around the world. He is a trustee of the Orwell Prize and advisor to the Booker Prize Foundation. Milee Ashwarya is the editor-in-chief for commercial and business books at Penguin Random House, India. In her decade-long career in publishing, she has been responsible for establishing and spearheading the commercial and business publishing division at Random House India, setting new trends and exploring new genres. She has published a whole range of bestsellers across segments and worked with authors and personalities like Piyush Pandey, Hussain Zaidi, Shobha De, Twinkle Khanna, Cyrus Brocha, and many others. Milee, I request you to initiate the conversation.
Thank you so much for the introduction. A very warm welcome to all the people in the audience, as well as to our stellar panelists this evening. Today's topic of discussion is Indian literature and its place in world literature. And to start off, I'd like to ask each one of our panelists, who are very interestingly from different countries, France, Germany, Australia, and the Great Britain, what comes to your mind when you think of Indian literature? Christoph, would you like to start off with that?
For me, Indian literature is a very vast and diverse field, because I specialize in the field of English literature from India. But of course, there are many other languages in India, and many other languages in India where authors are there, writers are there, and writing in these languages. So for me, for example, for my research, it was the obvious choice to do my research in the English aspect because I'm from the English literature background. But yeah, I was consciously aware of the fact that there are also other literatures, and then when you say Indian literature, it also includes other literatures. The other aspect is Indian, in that sense, is also a very diverse term, I would say, because for my research, for example, I tried to include diaspora writers as well as writers who are based in India. And I think even there it is very difficult to say. It's very difficult for me to define Indian in that sense. So it comprises a lot of things in that, a lot of concepts, so to say.
Yeah, I think I would tend to agree. For instance, I mean, if you asked French readers to give a few names, they would say Tagore. I'm almost sure. Then they would say Rushdie. Then they would say Naipaul. You see, who lived in Trinidad. Maybe Bisundat, his nephew, who lives in Canada. You know, I mean, so it's they wouldn't really firsthand be able to tell the difference between the diaspora and the Indian literature. But there's no doubt there's an interest in France. I would say that.
I think it's a very similar perception in Australia. Those big ticket authors, the big literary authors, which are known across the world. What penetrates less is probably the popular fiction, and what I would see as more contemporary work that I think just has less traction. And there's this idea that I think, particularly with my students, that Indian literature is going to be a particular kind of thing. So in that way, it's been Rushdieized. You know, they think it's going to be metaphysical, that it's going to be sensorially dense, that it's going to have a certain flavour, which is, as you say, doesn't represent the diversity of what it does.
Hello, is this working? Yes, yeah. Well, I'd like to endorse everything that's been said so far. It's an enormous territory, and for those of us who can get to know it through English or through translation, it's a territory which remains to some extent invisible, and I hope that's one of the themes that we can go on to discuss. So we're seeing little clearings perhaps, but we're not seeing the entire wood, and I hope that today we can talk about what a wider and deeper perception of the whole wood might look like.
Very interesting. You know, before we get on to the whole discussion about Indian writers in English in India and the whole diaspora writing in English from across the world, I just wanted to ask you, Boyd. Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children won the the Booker Prize, and it won the Booker of the Bookers. Do you think it changed anything for Indian writing or the perception of Indian writing?
It changed a huge amount. I mean, the question is not did it have this impact, but was that impact all to the good, or were there some deleterious consequences? We've certainly already heard about the Rushdie effect in terms of the imposition of a certain set of stylistic expectations on Indian origin writers, which I think has been something of a curse. I would say that I think to some extent the curse has been lifted, and that the pursuit of Rushdie imitators or wannabe Rushdies, which was certainly quite marked in the 1980s and 90s, has diminished, and I think there is now more of an acceptance of stylistic diversity. But in terms of the breakthrough of a certain kind of Indian literature written in English, literature which was to some extent concerned with contemporary and recent history, it was clearly an enormous breakthrough, and one which opened doors for other people. Maybe the harder question is to say, did it close doors for a certain kind of writing?
Very interesting. Now coming on to Indian writers who write in English and live in India, and the whole gamut of the diaspora writers who live across the world in different countries. what is the relationship, if there is, between these two whole gamut of writing, and are they similar, are there similarities, are there differences between the two? Boyd, would you like to take?
It's a very interesting and I think an enormous question. Certainly looking at it from a British perspective, where you now have not just a second generation diasporic literature, but to some extent a rising third generation literature, and clearly this is very different. Can it still be called Indian writing or Pakistani writing or Bangladeshi writing or whatever? How far is the relationship between the original family homeland and the homeland of the younger authors a subject itself? I think it's extremely interesting when you have, there are many examples, but a writer like Nikita Lalwani, who is a British writer, an Indian writer, a Welsh writer, since she was brought up in Cardiff. And one of her books, The Village, is precisely about going back to India and discovering what is to the protagonist quite a strange and alien place. And I think this has become an increasingly predominant theme in a lot of diasporic writing, but also a very fruitful one, because the perception of the recovered ancestral homeland, or whatever you want to call it, will be seen through eyes that have something different and hopefully revealing to contribute. So I think we've moved a long way from that terrible old cliche about migrant writers. I mean, the migrant literature was half a century ago. We're now into a completely new world, and the literary shape of that world is, I think, starting to emerge.
But it's also going in the other direction. For example, there are many. I totally agree with you that you say that we are kind of beyond Rushdie now, and you have other topics coming in. It doesn't matter if it's in India or in diasporic writing. But what I observed, for example, there's a writer like Rana Dasgupta, whose books, I mean, he moved from the UK to India, lives in India. He has kind of Indian family, Indian origin. Now he lives in Delhi, and his books have nothing to do with India at all. There is no Indian topics in there in the sense of that it's set in India.
He writes about Bulgaria.
Yeah, exactly. he writes about Bulgaria.
And his book about Bulgaria was a great source of perplexity and consternation
Exactly.
for some of his international publishers who were expecting something a bit more cliche-ridden and exoticized, I think.
Yeah, very interesting. So, and on the other hand, you have the second, third generation Indian origin writers in other countries, sometimes setting their stories in India. So, how far do you think is that a reflection of, how India is culturally at the moment? How much does it truly reflect the cultural landscape of India?
Well, I could speak a little bit to that in terms of the relationship between Australia and India has a long history with writing. So the various foundations and the consul send writers every year to India and vice versa as a kind of form of soft diplomacy, I guess. And you think this has been going on for years. And what is the actual effect of this? Not much at all, I don't think, in terms of its reach into a mainstream Australia. And so I think, I think at the turn of the 21st century, we might have thought, could the dominance of American and perhaps even UK literature be fading away, and for us in Australia, we're actually in the Asia Pacific. And I just don't think that has happened as much as we might think it has. I think there's still a long way to go in that sense, and we aren't engaging with that literature as much as we should be. And I think, at the Griffith Review, we tried to do an edition. We did an edition called New Asia Now, because we wanted to know, what are these voices now? And at the beginning, we wanted to do an edition that was all about writers under 30. And so we were going to call it 30 under 30.
They're all contemporary writers.
Yes, that's right. And we called for submissions, and we got an enormous amount of submissions from all over Asia, but hardly anyone was under 30. And so we had to abandon the idea. And then I had to go and I had to do research, I had to try and find them. And so then you're thinking, okay, so that's a problem as well. The young writers are not engaging with, the big journals too, so we can't find them. Where are they?
And this kind of exposure is really, really important if you want to share what you're writing. Taking from there, Regine, you've been a writer and translator for several years. How important is it to get the regional, local writing translated into English and other languages, global languages, so that they reach out to more people?
It's absolutely essential to have it in English. Obviously, we can't get it in French unless somebody from the south, the old Pondichéry. But no, nobody writes in French. So French publishers would read the manuscripts in English. And sometimes they would they would give someone a chance, a young voice, a chance before they are given a chance in other European countries. Like I found one example, I'm trying to find Bûcher-Chastel, I think, published Kiran Nagarkar's second novel before it was published in the UK. And Philippe Piquier is also another publisher who is looking for young voices, and there are two things that they're looking for. They're looking for very innovative, very different voices, and they're also looking for cliches. As, it's the French being interested a lot in foreign cultures. I mean, you must have seen foreign tourists, and a lot of them are French because they're just so attracted to India. So they'd be looking for all the cliches, in order they feel that they're learning about the foreign culture. So that might be the wrong reason for the success of a novel. But, success is success. You can accept it for whatever reason. There's nothing wrong about being successful because if you give pleasure to a reader. And I'm sure a lot of French readers would be interested in that. But they're also interested in very innovative and very provocative. And I think that might explain the success of The Alchemy of Desire, which sold more copies in France than it did in the UK and
that's really
in
interesting.
India. So
and why do you think that happened? Why do you think that happened?
I don't know. Somebody picked it up. Somebody said it's so unusual. It's so provocative. It's so so different from what you would expect from Indian writers that. It teased the readers.
So that's a cue to all budding writers in India. If you want to get published in France, this is the way.
You have to find the right publishers, and you can do this in three ways: through agents, through book fairs, and directly sending your manuscript in English. As long as you send it to the right.
This is really interesting. Anybody who writes here in India and is interested in getting published internationally, Regine actually has some interesting things to say about how you can get published in France.
Yeah, you can still send a manuscript without going through an agent. I think it's one of the rare countries, but you can do that. And with the right cover letter. Of course, cover letters are very important, and if you can write the cover letter in French, it's even better. But it's got to be very mouth-watering, and you get a chance. Certainly do.
Thank you so much. Boyd, you've been the judge of the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize and also the chair of the judges of the Man Booker International Prize. What is your take on the absence of translation of modern Indian writing in English?
Well, I tend to get very boring and slightly obsessional about this subject, so bear with me. At least it'll be the first time that I've bored you, however many times I've bored other people. It is extraordinary. I judged the Independent Prize for 15 years, and then this year the Man Booker International Prize. Considering works of fiction by contemporary authors translated into English from all over the world. And for instance, in recent years, we've seen a rising representation of Chinese language fiction, Japanese language fiction, Arabic fiction. And there is this huge gap on the map. And the gap on the map is the space where we should be seeing translations of fiction from the subcontinental languages. It's it's even more remarkable when I consider that having come to India on and off for the past 15 years, and sometimes I find translations in bookshops here. What seem to be very good translations published by big houses like Penguin India. And even those never seem to get any international distribution. So I can tell you a very interesting, just an exception to the rule of this absence of Indian writing from other languages is we had, for the Independent Prize, we had a wonderful shortlisted novel about 5 or 6 years ago, Chaurangi, by the Bengali author Shankar. And the extraordinary thing about that, it was a great novel, a great translation by Aranuva Sina. And the original Bengali edition had been published in 1962. We were reading it in English in 2008. So I think in the modern world, 45 years is a bit too long to wait, really. So I hope that in the future we won't have to hang around for quite so long a time before we get to see the fiction that we ought to be reading from India.
I think in a way it is music to a publisher's ears, because if there is interest in local Indian writing in English in the West and other countries, it's definitely heartening, and I will definitely try and take this forward as a publisher, because one of the things that we are very keen on doing is promoting local talent in whatever languages they write, English or local languages. And not only in fiction, I believe we have some great talent in poetry as well. What exists at the moment is, I think, a lot of translations of the classics or works written years back. But contemporary modern writing in English is not getting translated fast enough, and that is something that we need to work upon. Christoph, you've done your PhD in Indian writing in English. How was the experience? What made you choose the text that you did, and why?
Can I just briefly comment on the translation thing?
Sure.
Because I had in the session yesterday with Prashasti from German Book Office, we had exactly the same discussion about translations, and what we were discussing there was the question, why has it always to go through English? Because, for example, in India, especially in Pune, there are so many people who learn German nowadays for various reasons. Maybe not because they want to become literary translators, but some of them might even be capable of being literary translators, and that might be the case for other cities as well. It might be the case for French as well. And sometimes I think, for example, that would be a possibility for publishers to work together with an institution like the German Book Office, who is definitely interested in picking up these Indian local languages and get them translated into other languages, for example German, or for example English, or for example French. But it seems to me right now that if at all these translations do get out of India and are distributed in the world, then it's via English. It's not direct translations. And I think there is a huge potential, language-wise, for example. I can observe, because I'm teaching also German literature and at university, and there are extremely capable students who could fill this gap, so to say, or will be able to fill this gap in a few years.
Just taking from there, what kind of books do you think the German readers want to read?
Oh, that is a difficult
because
question.
If you meant direct translations, so what does a German reader expect from Indian writing?
I mean, the problem I see is, and that I think is maybe not only applicable to Germany, is that readers abroad have a certain exotic image in their mind, and they want to read about this exotic image to actually confirm their stereotypes. So I would say I would go counter the intuition of the German readers in that respect, and not promote and produce the books that are actually catering for this longing for exotism, but do something else. So in that sense, I would say, I mean, I don't know very well the literary scene in the other Indian languages, but for the English literature that is produced in India, I can say there's so many different topics. Some of them are set in villages, some of them are set in big cities, some of them are set in the northeast, some of them are set in the south or in the west, even in the English literature. So I can imagine, and some of them are set abroad, or and again in big cities or in small cities in Bulgaria. So the variety is huge. Oh, now it's working again.
You're back.
The variety is huge, and I think it's probably a trial and error, but it would definitely urge publishers to not go for the wrong microphone. So yeah, I mean, in that sense, I don't know. I wouldn't select any topic in that sense, if that answers your question.
But just staying away from exoticism and maybe
exactly
writing about the contemporary modern life as it is.
It's interesting because I mentioned Neil Bisundat before, nephew of the two Naipaul's, and he lives in Canada. And in a book that really impressed me called The Worlds Within Her, that was published in 1999, so a book I usually have a terrible memory and I forget books. I read a lot, and but that book impressed me because it's about a woman who is Indian and was raised in Trinidad, and she arrives in Montreal, I think, in Canada, and she sends her kid to school, and the kid is asked by the others, "What are you?" And so she goes back home and she asks her Indian Trinidad mother, "You know, what am I?" And the woman says, "Well, you're you. You know, you have several universes inside you, but you're you. You don't have to be from India. You don't have to be from Trinidad. You don't have to be from Canada. You're just you. You're a universe in yourself." And I think, you know, maybe that's also a very interesting vision, you know, is that each writer is a universe. And of course he comes from a country, and of course he has a culture, but a lot of Indians are so cosmopolitan. They have so many different, you know, the wealth of experience is so huge that they're a universe in themselves. And I think it's something that should be promoted.
But then maybe, Boyd, I could ask you too, but then who invests in this? Does it come from within or from without?
I think it has to be really quite a far-sighted mission, and the interesting question is which publishers are going to do it. The real problem is, as far as I can see, that it's simply the strength, the depth, the variety, the brilliance of Indian writing in English, to some extent, fools publishers into thinking that they have India on their lists, and of course they don't. All they have are Indian writers in English. I'm reminded of a conversation I once had with the writer Manu Chatterjee, and who was brought up in a more or less completely bilingual home, switching between Bengali and English. And I said, "Well, why did you choose to write in English?" And his answer was, "Well, in Bengali the competition was too stiff."
That's true.
And so I think if publishers abroad realise that quite what they're missing out of, the publishers are gamblers, but they're also they love to be ahead of the game and in front of the pack. And if you can persuade them that they really are losing some fantastic writing by not looking further into Indian writing in other languages, then I think they'll be tempted to go further. But of course, it also needs a core of extremely well qualified and able literary translators, and
yes.
That is an entirely separate question, which relates to how translation is taught, how translators are trained, which has big implications for institutions.
Yeah, because because translation is not even a field of study or a discipline in Australian universities. So we have a School of Languages, and I was talking to a professor there recently, and it's crazy that we don't have this discipline, that it's not even considered to be a pathway by students. It's not something they think about. It's not something that's embedded in our culture as it might be in France. And it just doesn't exist.
Yeah, I think it's a pity, but I think that's one thing that all the panelists here agree on, that Indian works in other languages definitely need to be translated. And there's a whole canon of writing in Tamil literature, Bangla literature, several languages written since years. And now we are trying to actually, at Penguin Random House, I just wanted to add that we're trying to get the translations out soon with the English edition. We're trying to do that with Perumal Murugan and K.R. Meera. So there are a couple of instances where we do feel that this will appeal to a global audience, and it's really important for more people to read it. But it needs to be done, I think, more actively by everybody. And Christoph, coming back to the question I asked you, a couple of minutes back, which you ducked, is your experience on the PhD that you worked on, and why did you choose the text that you did? Can you share with our audience a bit about that?
The choosing was the most difficult part, actually. I mean, I read a lot of novels. I started reading and I thought it will be easy and I will find texts easily because I like them. But then the problem is with the academic work, as many students here will know, is you also have to find like an academic question, so to say, that kind of links these texts, and that was a rather difficult task. So I read and read and read and read, and in the end my choice was really a mix between content on the one hand, but I actually got away from the content and more went into the direction to say, okay, I want more well-established authors. I want less well-established authors, well-known authors abroad. I want some. I have Amitav Ghosh in there. I have Salman Rushdie in there, and I have Sukito Mehta in there. But then I also have some, maybe at least abroad, less well-known writers in there, like Ruchir Joshi, or Namita Devi Dayal, or Raj Kamal Jha, or Siddhartha Deb, and so it was basically a mix of to kind of get like an image. 10 books is not much. I analyzed 10 books, but it was almost too much for this academic endeavor. But I had the feeling I have to have at least those 10 books to get a glimpse of how vast the field is. But then otherwise, I mean, for example, what highly motivated me with my research was I came to India for my research and I attended literature festivals like this one here, but Jaipur, Kolkata, and so on. And I have to say, I don't know, I haven't been to many literature festivals in Europe, but the literary scene in India is extremely lively. The authors are extremely approachable. You write them an email and they say, like, come to my house, we can have coffee or chai, and let's talk about it. And that was something also where probably I ended up talking to authors that did not end up in my research, but still I was happy to talk to them. That was maybe also like one aspect of choosing the text, maybe those that I've seen or heard at literature festivals in India. So.
And did you find a difference between the diaspora writers in English and Indian writers writing English in India? Because you're both in your...
Yeah, I think, I mean, that is one of my observations, that it's going in the same direction as Boyd mentioned before. I think in the 80s and 90s, the Indian, so to say, the Indians in India, they mostly were occupied with independence, like with these big national topics, so to say, like to come to terms with their own partition, their own national history, so to say. I think that was the big topic on that side. And then on the other side, the diaspora writers, they mostly were concerned with their experience of, their first-hand experience of being abroad. Like how difficult it is to be in Canada or in the US or in the UK. And I don't know, that's just a personal observation, but I have the feeling now in the first decade of the 21st century that totally changed. Now the Indian writers are definitely not only occupied with partition and national history, so to say, and same thing with diaspora writers. They are not only dealing with their own identity crisis, so to say, that they might have experienced abroad, but it's more. Some of them are going back to maybe their Indian origins, or write about entirely different countries that are not related to India, and the same happens from inside India. So I think I have the feeling we are coming closer again regarding the topics, but maybe you agree with it or not. I don't know.
Well, I just want to mention one example of that, because he's actually a friend of mine. He again, some people may think, oh, he's a Pakistani writer, but in a way he isn't. This is Hanif Qureshi, and whose family comes from, father's family comes from Bombay, British Bombay as it then was, and by the accidents of history, his father ended up working for the Pakistani embassy in London. So you can treat him as in some sense an Indian writer, I think. But if you look at the way that his work has developed, starting out in the early to mid 80s, very much with the migrant experience, and then absorbing that and almost channeling it into other forms which might be seen as much closer to the patterns of European literature, but still with an entirely individual and distinctive voice. And because Hanif has been writing for a long time now, for 35 years or so, I think in a way you can see in his trajectory a route which I think it's quite likely other people will not just will follow, but are already following. And it creates a literature which is enormously rich, but correspondingly fiendishly difficult to categorize or label, which I think is probably a good definition of literature itself. It's great writing that you can't stick a ticket onto.
That's quite true. Sally, you've written 2 novels, The Casuals and Atomic City, and we were talking about it earlier as well. You have you've talked about the Gulf War and the internet and Microsoft coming into India and bringing about a change in the lives of people and the youth who are growing up. How do you think, when you're writing, do you think of a global audience, or do you think it's easier for works of literature which have these certain global themes can travel easily to other territories and can find more readers across the globe?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think my publisher is HarperCollins, and they did not sell my international rights precisely because they said my books were very specifically Australian, even though I thought I was speaking to a larger tribe, which was part of the book was set in the 1990s and was about the grunge era, which of course was happening in Seattle, and that link between Seattle and Australia and other countries was very strong. And they sort of just didn't even really see that. And so there is a perception in Australia that, oh, if you set your book in Australia, it's limiting its reach. And I really disagree with that, because I read books set in all different parts of the world, and just because I have never lived in that part of the world doesn't mean I can fail to understand it. But it seems if you're from a regional place, so if you're a New York writer, of course, you're in New York. Yeah, so there's no problem. It's not considered to be parochial. But if you're in Brisbane, Australia, it's suddenly parochial, and so I don't get that. I want to read books set everywhere, and that what links us is the humanity, not the geography. And it's very frustrating as a writer to have that happen to you. So my next goal would be to try and find an international agent for the next book, and please don't mention us to HarperCollins. I'll get back to them. And to try and so that they don't limit me, because in fact they've limited me.
Interesting. Boyd, because you've been the chair of judges at Man Booker, I wanted to ask you, when you're making the long list and the short list, is that a consideration? Do you think about works which have a global theme or will travel to places?
Well, I think for an international prize, it's good to have as wide a reach as possible. But having said that, after all, we're looking for quality, we're looking for achievement, we're looking for really distinctive and original work. And I don't think the search for a balanced ticket should be an absolutely primary consideration. Having said that, I'm very glad that on our long list this year, we had writers from Indonesia, from Turkey, from China, from Japan, from the Democratic Republic of Congo, from Brazil, and the winner was the wonderful Han Kang from South Korea. So really I think the global fiction is absolutely central to what we could do in terms of understanding how we live at the moment, and this is what makes translation, a good translation, such an absolutely essential task. That in an era when we have an infinite number of news channels, hardly any of which are trustworthy, and most of which are copying each other, fiction. There's a wonderful slogan from the poet Ezra Pound, who once said that literature is news that stays news, and I think that's true of fiction, and we ought to be reading it as widely as possible, and also celebrating the translators who bring it to us.
So well put, and that's why Shakespeare is still so popular in India. It's still taught and it's relevant in a lot of situations, and so are many other books and writings of eminent writers. I'd now like all of you to make your closing remarks, and after that we can open the floor for questions. So we'll start with you, Crystal. Talk about your experience of Indian writing and being here in India.
I mean, the experience of Indian writing and of being here in India, because I'm based here in India right now. It goes hand in hand, I would say. I mean, I learned so much through the literature about India. I mean, when I came to India the first time, I hadn't read so many Indian texts, Indian English texts. And they, so to say, accompanied my experience of India. And I think there are many things when you observe them in your daily life, when you live here, that you don't understand. But then when you read a book, you suddenly understand them, because they're like slowly described. You can go back to the last page and look it up again. And I think in that sense, I do encourage, for example, my students also who study German literature. Many of them have never been to Germany. I think all of them have never been to Germany, actually. But still, I think you can learn a lot about other cultures. But then it doesn't substitute actually going there. I mean, I would say it is, I would encourage all of them, if they have the chance to go to Germany, they should go. But then if you already read a lot of German novels or poems or plays before, I think you have a better understanding of what's going on there. And I think it worked for me the other way around, and I would argue that works for any kind of literature.
As we're talking about literature, but a lot of the Indian writing comes to us through spiritual, yoga, all these spiritual experiences that the Indians are so well known for. And so a lot of people would read those, as a guide, as a way to find their way in life when they have doubts. And so
that is definitely an area where we're doing well. And books are reaching out to the global audience.
I just wanted to mention something about how a particular Australian writer writing about India And so I don't know if this was a popular book here, but Shantaram, David Gregory Roberts, very popular. But is it a novel or is it a memoir? You know, I mean, hello. Some of it I was thinking, does this really happen? And boy, he really can't write sex, you know. It was pretty bad. And it's lasted and lasted and lasted to the point where I can't wait for someone else to come along, you know. Johnny Depp was going to play him in the film. I hope this doesn't happen, you know. We need a new vision of India for us to, so we can get over it.
I just want to mention two Indian writers, one in English, one not in English, who from earlier generations whom I've always loved. Which goes back to the question of finding the universal via the particular, and that's R.K. Narayan, his wonderful books about Malgudi, where you see the entirety of human nature and human experience concentrated in a single village in South India. Wonderful, amazing books, so do read them if you haven't. The other, again, which I know only very imperfectly due to the inadequacies of the translation system, is the great Urdu short story writer Manto. And again, if you think that all Indian literature is about higher spirituality, then read Manto, highly erotic, decadent according to his critics, completely irreverent, very courageous, rather self-destructive, and for I always recommend Manto to people who love Chekhov because they kind of inhabit the same universe. So anyway, just 2 out of many.
And we have a couple of very good translations of Manto's short stories that we've published in English. So anybody who's interested can look that up. Well, I'd be very happy to open the floor now for questions. So we'll pass the mic around, and please raise your hands and introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hello, my name is Sakshi, and I would like to ask, is there any pattern in the Indian writing that works internationally? And my second question is that can Indian writing see a phenomenon like a Milton Boone or something of that sort? Thank you.
Would you like to take that question?
I didn't get the second question. What was the second question?
My second question is that can Indian writing and writers or something of that sort witness a phenomena like Milton Boone? Like it's still running, that kind of writing.
Love stories. You mean love stories?
Yeah, love stories are, because they have a series, and I guess most of the people know about Milton Boone even if they are not avid readers. That way I'm asking, yeah.
Difficult question. Patterns that work internationally, I mean, I think you rather would have to ask a publisher what works. I can only say, as I said before, I don't know any of the other Indian languages apart from English, but in the English literature I have the feeling it is the quality of the book that works. As Boyd also said regarding the Booker Prize list, I think it's not so much Indian topics and in that sense, but it's just like how does this person transport a certain atmosphere, a certain image, a certain characteristics of people and so on. And if that's extremely well done, I think that is valued worldwide, and that will be also probably the ones maybe considered for a Booker Prize or that will sell well. But then on the other hand, I think what fascinates me is, for example, people like Chetan Bhagat, they are not at all sold abroad as far as I know, not in Germany at least. So the popular fiction only seems to work in India, And I wonder if that is rather a national thing, and if we have that in every country, that there's a certain type of literature that only works in that country, that I don't know. In Germany, I haven't observed it so much, but in India, it's extremely interesting to have Ravinder Singh, Chetan Bhagat, maybe also Ashwin Sanghi, I don't know, like these extremely popular writers that are around these days.
Can I, this is something I'm not sure of, because I think it's only just really come to me, but we were talking about, do people simply want exotic depictions of India? And looking at the popularity of certain Indian and diasporic writers in the UK, I think readers are there sometimes looking for something quite different, and I'll tell you what it is. It is a kind of rich, mellow, intensive account of family life, of a kind that maybe some homegrown writers no longer do, or think is old-fashioned, or something that they think that fiction should have passed beyond. I'm thinking of the incredible success of books like Vikram Seth's A Suitable Boy, but going right through to younger writers, not just in the UK. Jhumpa Lahiri is a good example. Rohinton Mystery. So there's a certain sense that the very detailed, very sensitive accounts of various kinds of middle-class family life, which might be seen if they came from British-born or American-born writers as slightly out of time, or slightly something that won't get you good marks in creative writing school. I think that it's almost nostalgic. I think some readers in Britain are going to Indian origin authors for precisely that richly textured domesticity that maybe they don't feel they're getting closer to home.
But then for Amitav Ghosh, for example, that would not be so much the criteria. So I think there it is more about like depicting a certain period in time, for example, in his most recent trilogy, and also like the structure and the character development and so on. As I said, so I think there, but I do agree that a lot of texts in that are popular abroad as well do have some kind of family matters.
Some very few younger writers are doing that. I think there are some still. We're going to publish Manju Kapoor's book called Brothers, which is again about family life and about two brothers and their relationship. But in the younger lot, we have a lot of young Indian writers writing about romance and love stories. And to answer your question, actually, we did publish a series called Kama Kahani, which was similar to the Mills and Boons. We did four or five books under that. So you can look that up if you're interested in Indian love stories. Any other questions?
As Indians, we look at the English world as one. I'm speaking from here. We look at the English world as one. Okay? But when we approach them, then we find that there is something like an US publishers, they have the lobby. The European publishers in English language, they have the lobby. As you said, the Australian, they may be having the lobby over there. Then the US publisher says, okay, your book is more European kind of. I'm not speaking about India, but in general, all the topics which you have in the Western world kind of a way. So how do you deal with this kind of a topic? Do you have to approach them separately, or you have some solution for that?
What is your question? Is your question how can you get published abroad?
No. How do you deal with these lobbies?
Lobbies.
The American lobby,
Okay.
the European lobby, the Australian lobby of English language.
I think that one of the best things to do would be to look at the particular text that you have, and then to think, research what publishers are doing in each of those regions, and see which one it might travel with the best, to try and match it based on the text and not on a presumption of what has gone before. And then, but you would have to approach them separately, but to see which one, to do the research, to see which one it might travel with, that they might actually be interested in it. That's based on a previous list. But that's not to say that a publisher won't take a new direction or take a risk. But I think you can research their list to see what their interests are.
Good evening. Thank you for the lucid presentation. I'm Jayashree. I have a question that does a publisher like HarperCollins really can restrict you? Because today we are in the era of social media, and that whatever we want to convey, it travels very fast. Second thing, the people who wrote in the pre-independence or independence era, that is what they were experiencing then. Today, with the advent of the social media, we know what's happening with ISIS. Terrorism is a very hot topic in the present time. And the ones who are feeling this, and those videos which are becoming, or those photographs which are becoming viral, they are being debated on the media. So today, we are not just restricted to a form of writing, which is literature. We are also exposed to a lot of things which are traveling faster. So how would you comment on this?
Sally, would you like to take that?
Yeah, I agree. I think publishing has survived in its old, what I'd call its old structural forms. So it hasn't been affected like the music industry has, for example. The music industry completely crashed in the 1990s after the upsurgence of the internet in 1995. So you went from having massive companies like Universal to having very few at all. And then so the musicians had to adjust. And then we saw, you know, there's a lot of doom and gloom. A lot of people lost a lot of money. A lot of artists weren't getting their work out. But then it lifted again. The musicians had to readjust the way that they communicated with their audiences. And so we have the advent of touring came back. I think publishing is headed for a similar crisis, or this idea of when the technology is going to overlap. At the moment, the statistics are not showing that that's under any great threat. So big companies like HarperCollins will still continue to invest in textual production. But the way they're going to do that is going to shift. How they're going to survive that, I'm not sure. In fact, I'm not too worried about it. Being owned by Rupert Murdoch is not a fun thing, you know. And so bring it down. Let's see what happens. Crash the old structure and let's see what happens.
Next question, please.
Good evening. My name is Sikandar, and thank you for the wonderful insight, all four of you, in fact, all five of you. My question is directed towards Boyd. What was striking to me was the conversation that when Sally mentioned that who is going to invest in this, so to speak, non-stereotypical literature coming from India, and you said that the publishing houses have to be slightly far-sighted. And so my question for you, Boyd, is on a philosophical level, does a publishing house bear the responsibility of being an institute of literature and not an institute of commerce?
That's a fantastically good question. Since we have 1 minute 47 seconds left, the first thing I will do is to recommend you a book called The Art of the Publisher by a wonderful Italian writer and polymath called Roberto Calasso. The truth is, ever since the advent of printing, publishers have done both. They've both been commercial enterprises and they have been cultural tastemakers and change makers. The balance shifts in every generation, but the crucial thing is that seesaw must continue. So to some extent, yes, if they consider themselves publishers, rather than simply cash accumulators via the printed word, then they do have a duty to be farsighted. And in the long term, it will pay off. Not in 6 months, maybe not in 6 years, but when they can look at a list of Nobel Prize winning authors and say, we invested in that.
Just to add to that, I had recently a conversation with a publisher, from a big publisher in India, and he said that in his publishing house they produce certain books to earn money, to be able to afford certain other books that are content-wise really relative and interesting, and that's their choice to publish them, although they know that this will not be the best-selling thing, but there's kind of like a balance. And I think as long as publishers do that, I think as long as they work as both commercial and cultural enterprise, I think it's fine. It's only a problem if it tips too much towards one direction.
No, definitely. I think there has to be a balance between creativity, bringing out new voices, new ideas, and the commerce, and that's, I think, what every publisher should strive for. Next question, please. Time's up. All right. Thank you, all of you, for being such a lovely audience. I'm sorry we can't take any more questions. And thank you to all of you for being such lovely panelists and contributing to the discussion. Thank you.
I thank you all on behalf of PILF for your interesting inputs and a very interesting session. Thank you.